Here we are today. I'm Katherine Daniels, here together with Jim Knight, interviewing Claire Puchy for the Portland State University Oral History Project. It's July 19th, 2018, and we're here in the DLCD offices. Good morning, Claire.
Good morning. Nice to be here and see you again.
Good to see you again.
Well, I was living in Ohio and was working on a project. I had completed my master's degree in ecology, bachelor's degree in geography, and I was working on a project at Miami University which entailed supervising a whole team of people to put together basically a greenway plan for 2 counties and I don't know how many communities. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, they wanted me to go out to Oregon. And
how do we say Oregon?
Well, at that time, I said Oregon, and I learned.
And now you know what
now I know.
Okay.
But I was sent out for a conference because part of the agenda was focused on the Willamette Greenway goal. Mm-hmm. And I brought back a lot of ideas and information that informed the project in Ohio. But that's what got me initially connected to the program.
Program adopted as a goal by that time for you? Goal 15?
I think it was
or not?
Under development at the time.
Under development.
But I'm not positive. That would have been in 1974, so I'm not sure about that.
Well, that was later
Yeah.
for the Greenway.
But in any event, I learned
Sorry.
a lot more about the land use planning program and what was going to happen. I think the coastal goals were not adopted yet. They were just being discussed.
So
anyway,
what year was that when you came out?
I think that was the summer of 1974. It might have been 73. But in any event, I was so taken with the program and got to the chase. A few years later, there was a job opening, and I applied. I came out for an interview, and Jim hired me, offered me the job.
So what year was that you started?
I started in April of 1978.
Okay.
Yes.
So cut forward. I worked in Ohio for several years.
I was in 74.
Mm-hmm.
So about basically 3 or 4 years later.
Right. But
we needed to get the staff because we were so small.
we were
and
so
limited.
small.
And we had to have the staff because everything was coming in at once.
So you
That's
came
right.
on relatively early on.
Right.
How long did you work for DLCD?
I worked until December of 1984, at which point I took a job as director of the Portland Audubon Society.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, and that was a hard decision because I loved and believed in LCDC, the program, what I was doing, but I was really I had started to develop stronger interests, focused interests, as I think we all do when we're at that stage of our careers, and so I accepted the job in Portland, and then that led to other things. But anyway, because I had a background, a bachelor's degree in geography, more focused on natural resources, but I was also interested in urban land use planning. But when Jim offered me the job, it was to focus on plan review for goals 5, 6, 7, 8, and 15, which is
15.
a big load.
15, right?
Yeah.
Several
In
goals.
fact, all the goals, one way or another, have a natural resource connection.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Some much more than others.
Right.
But, goal 2, for example, you might say, well, there's nothing there. Hardly wrong.
Hardly.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, this is fun.
Did you change duties at all while you were at DLCD?
Not formally. My main focus was on plan review and also assisting cities and counties, doing a lot of not just hand-holding, but providing information, connecting the planners around the state with resources that they could tap into that they might or might not have been aware of. Working on the Goal 5 administrative rule. The first one, there may have been changes after I left. But that was the main focus. And Jim, you may recall some other duties that I had.
You were a technical resource person.
Right, right.
Not as if there aren't other people on staff who are
Right.
in the same way, but if there were questions about Goal 5 or natural resources, I would point them down the hall, quote unquote.
So
to the
give us a little
person.
refresher course. What resources did Goal 5 cover?
Oh, gosh, it was so broad.
Most of
I'm going to
them.
miss a few, I'm
Okay.
sure. Open spaces, wild and scenic rivers, wilderness, wildlife habitat.
History.
Yep, historic resources.
Huge array of things.
Mineral aggregate resources. It was a very, very lengthy list.
So now the agricultural and forest goals were very controversial at the
Yeah.
time. Was Goal 5 and the protection of those types of natural resources controversial in the same way or a different way?
I don't
Tell us
know
a
if they
little
were
bit
the
about
same or different way, but it definitely became controversial. I mean, this is going back in my memory a long ways, but one of the controversies had to do with the use of an inventory that the Nature Conservancy had put together and was given to, all the jurisdictions as kind of a leg up to help them with their inventories. And as I recall, it became controversial because in the absence of other information, I think that the commission started expecting or requiring, jurisdictions to use it and then explain why they weren't protecting some of these resources and
They had
putting
to
a
have,
justification for
basically,
it.
the inventories were given to them,
Mhm.
and then, of course, once they had the inventory, policies had to be enacted at the
They probably
local
didn't
level.
have other inventory
And
access to the
implementing
inventories.
measures,
Right.
were also to follow. So
Mhm.
connecting the dots, can I say it like that?
Yeah.
That were so critical, because a lot of the local governments didn't know much about what we were even doing.
Well, that's right.
Some of them, of course, were opposed, or local
Yeah.
officials were
Sure.
opposed, or not opposed automatically, but just, it was difficult.
It was difficult, and I think when I was first started, we didn't even have an administrative rule for
That's correct.
many of the goals. And so we sat down in that basement conference room, sometimes till the wee hours, just trying to figure out what these goals meant and what would be the requirements, what would constitute a plan that was worthy of acknowledgement. And those were fascinating discussions. I remember we went round and round and round about a lot of them. And it was not until, I can't remember the year, that we came up with an administrative rule for Goal 5, which, by the way, Ann Squire kind of outlined on a little paper napkin at the White Coaster restaurant one day,
yeah.
trying to just kind of formulate the concepts.
Is that because more specifics were needed?
Yeah, oh, yeah,
Than
guidance.
were in the goal?
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that some of the jurisdictions felt that maybe we were all over the map and weren't as consistent as we needed to be in application of the goal, but whether that's true or not, I think there was a perception of that. And so the rule, I think, was really necessary to help provide some guidance.
Consistency was
And
another
consistency was a
important-
big, big issue.
Yeah.
So one of my duties was to put that rule together, get it to the commission, go around the state, having public meetings, basically, hearing, comments about it, and then
This, of
refining
course,
it.
was not the only rule we had.
Right, right.
Sorry.
But it did become controversial. It became controversial with the timber industry. And we're talking about the days of spotted owl wars and R2 wilderness. A lot of the state's environmental programs were really starting to ramp up, and I think Goal 5 was, I wouldn't say getting caught up in it, but a lot of people were skeptical, about the nexus and wild and scenic rivers and designation of quarter-mile stretches alongside rivers and what would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed. So there were a lot of balls in the air and a lot of things in play, as I recall.
Were there interactions with goals 3 and 4, agriculture and forest land protection? To some extent, were they useful in helping to protect any of those Goal 5 resources?
There probably was a connection. They probably were helpful in some cases, but that's where my memory is kind of fuzzy.
Minimum lot size, large minimum lot size.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the challenge in working with Goal 5 is, in some cases, it's not the best tool. Planning and zoning is not the best tool for protection of some of these areas. Outright purchase of land, easements, things like that might be better, but that was not what we were charged to do.
Those are more specific tools.
Those were more specific tools.
Yeah.
And so we had tools in our toolbox, but maybe not the whole range that you might think about when you think about protecting resources.
Well, what worked well about Goal 5 and what didn't work so well?
Oh, goodness. Well, I think the thing that didn't work so well is that it was so big.
Broad.
So broad. And some of the, even with the administrative rule, I mean, you had things like mineral aggregate resources, which you're supposed to protect, and that could sometimes conflict with, some other things that were being required to protect, wildlife habitat, streams, fish and wildlife. So, internal to the whole
and
goal
recreation.
And recreation.
That was a big deal.
Yeah. So just trying to tease those kinds of things out, or having the counties and cities trying to reconcile those differences, gather the information, do the EC analysis, environmental, social, economic, energy, was challenging and not without controversy. But on the other hand, what worked well, I think, was that there were resources available publicly. We had a host of really good people in other agencies that really stepped up to the plate and worked hand in hand with us and with the communities, and nonprofits like Nature Conservancy. So,
and the local governments had their own interest representatives.
Yeah, good point.
The League of Oregon Cities and the Association of Oregon Counties, and the people that were over there, we would work with them, not always on the most harmonious terms, but nevertheless, we tried to work with them so they would be able to assist their various members. We weren't the only ones out there doing this, obviously, and so we could bring them on board and make them realize this is not the end of the world.
That's right.
It's not easy work, but here's the help we can give you, and you can get assistance and so forth.
And we had great field representatives too, who lived right there in the communities and had their pulse on tough jobs, on kind of the sediment that was out there, and it wasn't always the way we saw it in Salem.
I remember doing the reviews at the same time as you for all the other goals, especially goals 3 and 4, but also all the other goals, except your goals, and then turning my reviews over to you to do all the natural resource goals, and being glad to be able to do that.
One thing I will also say, about the challenges is that when I was first given these assignments, there was so much focus on establishing urban growth boundaries, on protection of farm, forest lands, that in some ways I think Goal 5 didn't get as much attention. Because,
it's been called the orphan goal.
I hadn't heard that until I got your email, but I'm not surprised. It was in the early days of plan review. I remember a couple of us saying, you just mention the word historic preservation and you get a pass. Well, that's a little bit of a stretch, but I think that it wasn't given as much scrutiny, but that started ramping up, which is partly why it became rather controversial in some cases.
Do you think the goal achieved what the legislature had intended? It's hard to know what they intended.
It's really hard to know, but I think in general, especially with the first round of plans, when we weren't really sure ourselves what was intended. I think over time, with more information, tools. I mean, we didn't even have GIS at the time. I mean, more inventories.
We didn't even have our own computers.
Right. So maybe the answer would be yes initially, and then over time, hopefully things improved. Yeah. By that time, I had left the agency, so I can't say that I followed things as closely after that.
Do you have any interesting stories or incidents or relationships with certain counties or cities I know this process the process of planning and zoning in general was pretty new to counties. And to have to take on not just ordinary planning and zoning, but very specialized planning and zoning was certainly a new thing for them.
Yeah, right.
As opposed to the cities.
Yeah.
Which were also better staffed. A lot of the
Right.
counties just had a single county planner there, who sometimes didn't even have a background in
Right, and
planning.
in Central Oregon, I think Jefferson, maybe not Deschutes County, but there was one planner who did plans for 3 counties.
Like a circuit rider?
Yeah, kind of a circuit rider. And, but I probably have a million stories to tell, but I do remember when I was leaving the agency, there was a pretty hard-fought battle to protect the Jackson Fraser wetlands near Corvallis. And there was a man who was a developer. He wanted to put, I think, low-income housing on the wetland. And that was very controversial. We convinced the commission to provide protection for that resource.
Because the local government wasn't all that interested in doing much.
That's right.
If I can recall it correctly. So convincing, quote unquote.
So it was protected, still is, as far as I know.
Yes.
Honorable, because I seem to remember another wetland in that era that was dug up and removed without.
Well, there probably
permission.
were, and I know
Probably
that
more than one.
One of the challenges was, once you work with communities, counties, to identify resources and then expect them to go through analyses. In one instance, I remember, I think it was down somewhere in Douglas County, a grove along the river of old trees were taken out in advance of decision-making, just so that they wouldn't have to deal with it. And those were some of the risks, of having state requirements that people were fearful of that could affect their income. And I think maybe, in a way, because I can speak for myself, we were idealistic.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
At that time, I was not a landowner. I am now. I've dealt with rules and regulations in rural areas as a landowner myself, to come more and more to appreciate, the heavy hand of government. And
So what was it like working with a bunch of colleagues your age at DLCD with a brand new program?
It was exhilarating. It was just one of the best experiences I've ever had professionally, and I think that's why we stay in touch. Even if we don't see each other often, there is still a network. And but it was exciting to be part of a brand new program, wanting to do the right thing for the public good and for people, for resources, for the land. This is such an incredible state. I think we all just kind of fed on that energy, and to put in horrendously long hours to meet deadlines, and some were legislatively imposed deadlines. Some were, imposed by the commission. But
As you can recall, both of you going to the commission, we haven't talked about the role of the commission vis-a-vis the department, but we would go to the commission and say, here is our recommendation, the local government's request or desire, and that would cause considerable.
Often it would be just to one part of the submission.
That's correct.
Maybe just to one goal or 2 goals,
That's
whereas
correct.
the rest would be
And some of the parts would be okay, but we would have to send them back to deal with certain tough issues like the ag question or the forestry question,
Typically the natural
or the
resource.
UGB question, because that forced the counties and the cities that were close, connected to work together on developing and agreeing upon that urban growth boundary. Which, like here in Salem, we have 4 communities, 2 counties.
Right.
Polk and Marion, and then 2 cities.
River
One we're
Tree.
sitting in now, and one just north of us. And it's working. Is it perfect? No. But wow.
wow, that's
Let's
right.
think that what we've done in Oregon is 200 and was it 40 cities we have, right? I think something like
Something
that.
like that, yeah.
All of them have UGBs.
Yeah.
Some of them are way out in eastern Oregon and are facing fires today, sadly.
Yeah, right.
But they hardly have any growth needs. That's going to come on in the next 10 years or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Other ones coming over to the coast or the valley and the Portland area, boy, those are tough issues.
Yeah. You know, one of the tough issues that we dealt with under Goal 5 and affected so many other goals too is water.
Yep.
Water resources. That was a big deal. And in some respects, in some areas, I think maybe weren't forceful enough, although when we pushed,
Yes.
we got a lot of feedback. And I can think of the city of Echo,
Yes.
Stanfield, who wanted big urban growth boundaries and had expectations that water would be there, and yet all the information we had from the Water Resources Department said, that's just unrealistic, and they were starting to mine the groundwater. And that was back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Was there overlap between your duties with respect to Goal 6 and water issues and Department of Environmental Quality? Is there any confusion?
Yeah,
Or?
I don't know if there was confusion. There was certainly, a connection there, and an expectation that the communities would, produce plans that were consistent with those state laws. And but for water, it really had to do with quantity and quality of those resources that were, especially for an urban community,
Very relevant today.
very, very relevant today. And with climate change, and
That's coming on.
that is coming on, and we're going to have climate refugees moving into the state.
And that goal's really never been developed. No rule, no.
That's a scary one.
Not much
I
development.
think that's one that hopefully the department will really give some serious thought. I know wildlife biologists are already, really starting to think about it in terms of not putting together plans that are static, but plans that are adaptable and kind of can, I'm talking about wildlife management plans, not land use, that really can address the changing conditions. When you start seeing the gorge, oak pine habitat turn to sage, I'm not saying that's going to happen overnight, but all indications are that we'll see those kinds of shifts, sometimes elevational shifts, sometimes regional, north-south.
One of the interesting issues I think is out ahead of us still is evaluation of the program and how we're doing. And I'm not saying it isn't occurring in other ways, but we really sat back and think, well, what have we gotten from our UGBs, and what's working, what's not working.
And are we prepared to take on the changes that are occurring,
Right.
such as, climate change, population growth, huge population growth? Are our goals and rules up to taking on those challenges?
Right. I think another big challenge is that, so many people are moving in from out of state. They're not familiar with the program, for one thing.
Exactly.
And in some cases, they come from states or communities that have had no land use planning
Right.
program at all. That was one of my challenges when I was the director of the Gorge Commission years later. Not so much the Oregon side, because we had land use planning, but
Right.
on the Washington side, those three counties, having a national scenic area and the requirement to produce land use plans over there really caught their attention big time, and not in a real positive way, because they weren't even used to having local ordinances. So just educating the public, keeping those conversations going, just
Right. Because the program's not in the news the way it was at one time. So most people in the state today either weren't born or haven't moved here and are fairly unfamiliar with the program,
Yeah, right.
as are a lot of legislators unfamiliar with the program. Well, talk to us a little bit about some of the other goals you worked on, other than Goal 5.
Oh, Goal 7, natural hazards.
Right.
And that's as relevant today as it was back then. We spent a lot of time focused on getting communities to look at their floodplains and, zone appropriately. Not always with a lot of success. There was a lot of pushback there too, because people like living by rivers, you know. And even along the coast, and this is where there's, you know, a relationship with the coastal goals, but, you know, beach erosion, cliffside erosion, tsunamis, threat of earthquakes. And again, I think, you know, back then there just wasn't as much information available. Some communities would have to hire professional geologists just to do assessments. And so that was a big one. And yet, at the same time, I think we were viewed as leaders nationally on that. I was invited to speak at a national conference on floodplain zoning down in San Francisco.
Interesting.
You know, and not that other places in the United States weren't working on it, but we were recognized as having something that was a little different and progressive.
Now, was the coastal zone management program in effect back then in the early 80s?
I believe so.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. And of course, the program, DLCD, is doing a lot more on hazard mitigation, tsunami planning, that sort of thing now.
Good.
But you began that.
Yeah, we
then.
had to. I mean, that was not only a requirement under Goal 7, but one that, you know, when you really think about it, it's scary if communities are not.
Well, they also had federal requirements too.
Yeah, FEMA was.
FEMA was as well. So you had to assist local governments in dealing with a range of interests, local, obviously, or private sector, if you will, local governments, and they have their own interests, and then the counties, meaning state agencies is what I'm really trying to say.
Yeah,
And
Dogamy was
it wasn't just us, but we were often in the middle of a lot of this stuff and trying to bring it all together. Wow, and then the federal government had interests.
And the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, we had a close relationship with them. And of course, they provided good technical support and information. And again, it goes back to my point about really having strong partnerships with a lot of different state agencies. You know, we weren't taking over their programs or anything, but trying to work together and support one another's programs and support local communities.
We had agreements with agencies.
Yes, that's right.
And we had an administrative rule that would direct us to work with the counties, the cities, I'll get there, sorry, the other agencies, and bring them along as partners, but also when there was issues of conflict or whatever, we would have to work them out.
And their program had to be consistent with the statewide planning goals.
In general, right. We did.
As far as Goal 8 is concerned, recreation, there again, a partnership with state parks, the SCORP, reports that they would issue, and we worked closely with them on, and this is another part of Goal 5 actually, the trail, the trail along the coast, and an inland trail in the desert, wild and scenic rivers. They manage those programs, but the expectation was the counties and in some cases cities would develop their plans and ordinances to carry those out.
How about the Greenway goal?
Oh, the Greenway goal, that was a big one. If you take a look at the goal itself, it's probably the longest goal in terms of verbiage. I'm not sure, but there were so many components to it, and of course it's a long river that goes through many communities and counties.
It's the Willamette River.
It's the Willamette River, and state parks had a huge role initially, and we worked very closely with Wally Hibbard. Remember Wally? And several other people whose names I can't remember, but they were to carry out plans to have not exactly a continuous greenway along the whole river, but more or less. And then part of the goal focused on purchasing some important pieces of property.
Was this greenway, was the goal public access along the whole?
Not along the whole thing, I don't believe, but I think that was one of the objectives, is to make it more or less publicly acceptable, just about everywhere. And Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was also a provision, because it was controversial about the takings issue was big. And so I think it's either in the goal or an administrative rule that basically limits the purchase of land
I think so, yes.
to just those 5 areas along the Willamette River and nowhere else. That would be it. So the rest of the goal had to be carried out through policies, ordinances, zoning.
There was a lot to deal with. Wow.
You had a lot of goals.
I did have a lot of goals.
Or pieces of gold.
Or pieces of goals, yeah. But had good supervision, good partners.
Yeah, and we had legal advice from the AG's office, and good people there. But we didn't always agree with their advice, frankly.
Right.
But we got worked along, and a lot of good people over there.
And we had some very strong commissioners, too.
And strong commissioners.
Who did their homework.
Steve Schell was our number 2 commissioner. The vice chair, I guess you might say, with LB Day was number 1. But Steve was very, very adamant in the final stages of the first 14 goals. We had to have a coastal, or a shorelands goal, excuse me. It wasn't just coastal, but shorelands goal. And he argued and made a good case, but in the end it was not adopted. And he didn't like that, but that's the way it was.
I remember the commissioners being very supportive of some staff.
Yeah, I think for the most part that was.
I remember Ann Squire being very outspoken, very supportive. Were there any major court rulings in the state that either undercut or advanced any of the goals that you work with in any way that you can remember? I know a lot of them had to do with...
memory fails me.
Well, I know a lot of them had to do with farmland and with agricultural land or urban growth boundaries, but I don't know if there were any other ones in there that may have affected the goals you worked with. Do you remember?
If there were, I can't remember.
Yeah,
Jim,
I don't have a good grasp of those
I don't remember either.
They were property rights related to some extent.
That's, probably they would have been.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
I think the takings issue, though,
Yes.
I think that's where someone, I don't know if it was somebody, like Bob Stacy, 1,000 Friends, would say we have a fairly limited law on takings, and so therefore we had a little more latitude to implement some of the goals or get them implemented.
I remember at the time...
Without straying into a takings issue.
In the late 80s and in the late 70s and early 80s, there had been a number of cases that had gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court on takings in general. And I remember at the time that the thought was that if there's a reasonable economic use left to the land, that's enough. As long as there's some reasonable economic use. And certainly that was used as a justification for the farm and the forest land protections. And I'm not sure how that might have affected Goal 5 resources.
Well, I think in the case of Jackson Fraser wetlands, that I think might have been an issue there too, and there must have been some reasonable use of part of that property.
Yeah, part of the property, right. You couldn't, as long as you only took a small part of the value away and most of the remainder was there, then it would be all right.
Yeah, and I can't remember exactly, but it could be that the important part of the wetland was undevelopable anyway.
That would
But
make a
again, my
difference.
memory is...
That make a difference, yeah. So after you left DLCD and you went on to other jobs, you continued to work in the natural resource area, especially with fish and wildlife, right?
Yeah, I left DLCD in January of 1985. I became the executive director of the Portland Audubon Society. And so I was very involved in conservation issues, but also started, getting my management skills kind of honed. And then I was there for 5 years, and then I spent the next 10 years at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And for most of that, I headed up the state's, what used to be called the non-game program, the Wildlife Diversity Program, which was the statewide program for keeping track and managing all the species that are not hunted or angled. And So yeah, natural resources, and again, managing people.
And you were the director of the Gorge?
And then after
Commission.
that, I was the director of the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area.
So did you have any interaction with Goal 5 issues in the capacity of that work?
As director of Audubon, there might have been, because I was, Paul Ketchum and Dick Benner and I were called upon by Governor Goldschmidt to come down and get a bill passed before the end of the legislative session, and this was in May, and so the session didn't have much more time. But Gail Achterman basically facilitated a group that consisted of the three of us representing the conservation community and people from the timber industry. We had to hammer out basically a new Forest Practices Act that satisfied just about everybody, and it was. We were down in the basement of the Capitol from early morning till late at night, day after day after day, until we hammered out a bill that passed at the very, very last. Nobody liked it. It wasn't perfect, but it did make some improvements that we may not like it today, but at the time it was the best anybody could do, I suppose. So yeah, I kept my fingers a little bit in that. But not as much at ODFW, and not so much with the Gorge Commission, because we had our own, management plan for the Gorge and expectations for the counties and cities there. And then after that, I spent the last 10 years of my career working for the city of Portland, and I managed the development of a framework for managing the watersheds in the city.
Wow.
Which ended up, spawning watershed management plans for different parts of the city of Portland. And then the last 5 years of that job, I managed the city's terrestrial ecology program and put together a lot of, they weren't administrative rules, but they were basically guidelines, guidance documents to avoid conflicts when different infrastructure projects were being developed to avoid impact on fish and wildlife, especially wildlife, birds. So I kept my hands in a lot of different things.
Quite an experience.
So Jim, do you have some questions?
So I have questions, how did we do, obviously, and that's a very compressed question, but I think, how are we doing, and how have we done, and who's getting those questions, and are those issues being changed as time goes on? Maybe certain legislators might say,
Have we
"Gosh,
done?
your program doesn't do anything at all for us, and in fact, it's harmful to us." And
Right. Have we done, and what changes, if any, do you think should be made to the program
That's
in your
where
goal areas?
Yeah, that's where I have not been paying as much attention. I mean, my career just took me in.
Narrowed.
It narrowed.
I don't know that Goal
One thing.
5 has changed all that much.
Really? I know that there were some changes to the administrative rule
That's
after I
right.
left, and I don't know, I really don't have a feel for how those have worked.
I don't.
I don't even know who is our Goal 5 person here. at the
Well, I know
agency.
Bob Rooney worked on Goal 5, the Goal
He's-
5 rule change.
He's retired now, of course.
Yeah, I know.
But your question's a good one.
Yeah, well, let's assume it hasn't changed that much. I don't think it has changed very much. And I do know that some of the same issues that you've raised continue to exist today. So looking ahead and the challenges that we do face, you mentioned climate change, population growth. What recommendations would you
Oh,
make?
boy. Well, going backwards a little bit,
Yeah.
any of your
anecdotally
what
goal
I've
areas.
seen, and what I've seen in other jobs that I've had is kind of an erosion of a lot of natural resources, especially when it comes to fish and wildlife, because my job at ODFW is to really work with entities, and federal agencies and state agencies, and to really keep a pulse on the status of species. I mean, that's a state law, that was the requirement, and And I'm not saying it's all attributed to land use planning and zoning or decisions at the local level, because a lot of it was due to federal policy on federal lands. But sometimes I would witness, the loss of some important resources, and that my mind would go around thinking, well, what was the EC analysis, or what was their community interest in protecting the resource, and how strongly was the goal or the local land use plan adhered to. But where we're going, that's one that I'd have to give a lot more thought to, because I've mentioned the climate change, the population growth, water.
Some parts of the country do, of course, like a mini NEPA or more of a direct environmental assessment of environmental attributes on a site-by-site basis. And I know that a previous director, actually Richard Whitman, when I was working recently, had been thinking about a Goal 5 rule change that might have required that kind of site-specific review for larger scale developments, not just for anything. Do you think something like that would be helpful? Would that go hand in hand with our broader scale Goal 5 protections, or would that be instead of that? Or
I guess I would have to take a look at how that compared with the EC analysis that's done, and
there's probably some similarities.
There's some similarities, but then again, I don't know how that would really play out with timelines and reviews and local input. But I would say probably that works better on a larger scale. I think on individual sites. First of all, that's a lot of work for local planners, but I don't know. I'd have to give that some thought. I'm not familiar with what other states have done with.
Right, and it may be that some cities with more staff already do that. I don't know whether whether counties do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot up in the air for cities and counties to deal with. I don't mean just in land use either.
We look at transportation. And that's
public safety, lots of these unpleasant issues.
Well, failing infrastructure.
Transportation, we're having a big discussion here in Salem about should we build a third bridge over the Willamette. Bob Courtwright, remember Bob, is retired now, adamantly opposed to a bridge. I mean, he thinks, yes, there needs to be issues and steps taken to help deal with the transportation questions, but he's saying that to spend what would be $400 million or some crazy figure like that. And where are you building? All those kind of big questions.
When I think about these future challenges, and I think about climate change, that disproportionately affects the natural resource areas that you worked on.
It does, yeah.
And of course, growth in general affects those resources. The farm and the forest land protections have some very specific protections that will help protect those lands from, perhaps not from climate change challenges, but from growth challenges. To some extent, they'll be protected. But I wonder whether the Goal 5 resources are going to fall through the cracks, or whether they're going to...
Yeah, I wonder about that too. And then you even look at the urban interface areas and the wildfire risks and the resources that are spent, fighting fires to protect development in areas, and should they even be allowed there?
Exactly. Although there's been less loss of development in our forest lands than in other states in the area, because we don't have as many houses out there. So here's another challenge. Our counties have never gotten any additional funds to update their comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances.
Really?
So those, in the last few years, a few counties have gotten a little bit of money for updating the farm and forest land provisions of their zoning ordinance. But otherwise, their comprehensive plans are from the early 1980s.
Oh my gosh.
So what does that say with respect to the protection of the natural resources that you worked on? Sorry to tell you that.
That's really bad news.
But we're talking about the original ESE analyses and the original decisions that these communities made. A lot of the cities, well, the cities over 10,000 would have updated their plans by now, but the areas with the most natural resources will not have updated. There's a couple of counties that have taken it on themselves to do that, but only literally a couple, and the rest won't unless they have funding to do so.
Well, that explains some of what I've been seeing, and wondering about as I've, traveled
The lack
around.
of funding is a challenge.
Yeah, it is.
And the feeling on the part of the legislature that the money should go to the areas that are growing most quickly, the cities over 10,000. But it's not as though rural areas don't have challenges as well, and changing conditions.
Yeah. Well, that almost points to, what I mentioned early on about partnerships with other entities and looking at other tools. Land trusts. There are some land trusts that are doing good work in the state. There are nonprofits. There are private individuals. I think maybe this is the time for the department to maybe reassess what's out there. How can Go5, some of these other, rural-focused goals be implemented successfully while we still have a chance?
And a lot of the state agency agreements could probably be updated. And the original people at each state agency who worked in partnership with DLCD, a lot of those people are no longer there. And those agencies don't necessarily have a person assigned to that task anymore to coordinate with DLCD.
Well, that would be another one to work on, I would say. And maybe that wouldn't cost as much.
Yeah, that's just my observation from having retired just 2 years ago. Yeah, lots of challenges.
Lots of challenges, more than I even realized we were having.
But still a lot of enthusiasm and commitment at DLCD.
I can't tell you much about what's happening upstairs.
You can't.
No, I know a few people. Right now, we're down to a couple of people. Rob was here, of course.
How do they spend most of their time? Do they spend most of their time working with
Rob's on
cities?
part-time, by the way. He's retired in a way. I shouldn't say in a way, but he's retired, but he's back a couple days a week.
Yeah, they're doing, the natural resource people are doing technical assistance. Well, Amanda Punton is the Goal 5 person, and I believe she's half-time or three-quarter time. And so the natural resource people are doing plan amendment review and technical assistance. A lot of technical assistance, a lot of answering the questions from
that's
planning people out in the field, and also developers, lawyers, people who are calling. So they're all busy, very busy, and they can't keep up with the potential need for rule changes. Amanda Punton, for example, has a lot of ideas for improvements to Goal 5. But there's the commission and the staff only has a limited capacity to work on a certain number of rules, and there's always urban issues at the forefront. Urban growth boundary issues, now housing issues. And so the natural resource people have to really, fight to get agency, staff and commission time devoted to those natural resource issues.
Are there still many appeals?
Very few.
Very few. So that is
the staff,
good news, I guess.
Well, the staff regularly recommends appeals, and the department management goes along with, supports some of them, and of those, the commission supports some of those. So a relatively small proportion of the appeals recommended by staff actually gets supported by the commission. although at the moment it's a very strong commission. There's a reluctance. There's on the part of the department, I think, to be proactive. They are more in a reactive kind of mode
Right.
than a proactive mode, which is concerning to me. Yeah, so.
Yeah. And when I was with the department, oh my gosh, we were both proactive and
There were quite a few appeals.
Quite a few appeals, yeah. It was, some of the commission meetings I recall would go for several days, and one in particular, I think it was Multnomah County's acknowledgement.
Yep.
We didn't even take a break for
Yep.
lunch or dinner, one of those, and it went till midnight. I think around either midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, I think Ann Squire said, "Folks, we're not even thinking straight anymore,
No.
let's take a break and
Yeah.
back in the morning." It was,
I don't think Thousand Friends does as many appeals anymore either. I think both Thousand Friends and DLCD are kind of in a mode of really wanting to be helpful to municipalities and devote a lot of time to helping them through issues. I think that's the push now. But I'll just add one other thing, even though this isn't my interview. I was there at the agency at the same time you and Jim were, so of course we all worked together. And I was left the state for 23 years. And when I left the state, it was a highly controversial program. When I came back 23 years later, I found a much higher degree of acceptance of the program. Maybe it wasn't real noticeable to those of you who had been here the whole time, but it was to me on the part of staff planning directors, county planning directors, city planning directors across the state, but also a lot of boards of commissioners at the local level, and I found that very heartening. With respect to the natural resource issues, a much higher degree of acceptance, and that is
What's
good.
the cause of that, or the reason for that?
I think it's familiarity over a long period of time and acceptance of a program that people realized was here to stay. And of course, there have been a number of adjustments to the program over the years that have addressed some of the key concerns that legislators and county planners and commissioners have had. But also the program has been strengthened in some ways as well. Some give and some take over the years, especially with respect to the farm and the forest land goals, which were the most controversial elements. So I certainly see from a positive perspective of the program, even though there are a lot of challenges going forward, that there is a high degree of acceptance among people who are familiar with the program, among people who have worked with the program, or longtime residents of the state.
and that goes along with what I said about my job with the Gorge Commission, working with the counties and the communities on the Oregon side. I mean, there really was not only acceptance of the state land use planning program, but, the requirements of the National Scenic Act.
Which can be
Which was
more
even more
stringent.
stringent, definitely more stringent, but the planners just had a high degree of acceptance and knowledge, and they were much easier to work with, and I think they were more successful in having their plans and ordinances approved.
Interesting, because Washington County doesn't have the same rigor in land use controls as Oregon does. Yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation today? Or Jim, anything else you'd like to ask? Did we miss anything? We covered quite a few goals.
There's a lot more stories, but those can wait for another interview.
I'm going to ask a question, I think on your list there to number 16.
Okay.
If you were again involved in such an undertaking and had the chance to influence the development of new comprehensive land use planning program, what lessons learned from Oregon's approach would you borrow? What aspects of the Oregon land use program might you avoid? There's a lot there.
There's a lot there, and that's such a
And that's not an
question.
easy question to cope with, but
No.
that's what we are facing, I think, in the next, say, 10
Yeah.
or 20 years.
I mean, it's one thing to look back and say,
Yes,
we
we should
did what
have
we
done.
did at the time, and I think, given those times,
But now, we're looking forward.
looking forward,
And
and
money is hard to come by.
Money is hard to come by.
Uh,
Challenges are great.
Relationships with the federal government currently are all coming like this, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
how about either of you, in terms of what you think about the future?
I'd be repeating myself a little bit, but go ahead.
Lessons learned?
If any, or if there's many to be thought about, no question.
In my car, I think I mentioned I've got a
Your
box of
box.
old documents, and I found one. I just happened to open a file that I had, money named Tom McCall.
There you go.
And in that document were some speeches, some newspaper articles, but there was one quote, and it referred to the land use planning program. And Jim, you'll probably remember this, but it had something, I should have brought it with me, but it had something to do with, for goodness sakes, allow a little bit of schlock, because basically if you don't, bring down the whole program. You've got to know how to give a little, adjust a little, accept some
Interesting.
deficiencies. And this was from Tom McCall.
Interesting.
I'll get that for you, but he was a strong, supporter of the program for sure. But even he realized that, and I found this to be true with the Gorge Commission too. Got to work with people in communities and try to step into their shoes and understand what they're facing and work with them rather than be so bureaucratic and dogmatic. Otherwise, you can bring down whole programs because the backlash can just kill you. And
Here's a quote from Governor McCall. This is in the paper I put together, and I borrowed, if you will. I think you may have copies of it. I don't know, it's this one here, Western Planner. Maybe you haven't seen this before, but here's a famous excerpt that he gave to the opening session of the 73 session. Oregon is an inspiration even to those who do not come here to live. The story of the Willamette River, our ecological Easter, has evoked cries of hurrah across the nation and in distant parts of the world. And we have heard, along with applause for Oregon, lamentation of other states where progress has fell prey to expediency. But there is a shameless threat to our environment and to the whole quality of life. Unfettered despoiling of the land, sagebrush subdivisions, coastal condominium, remember that phrase, and the ravenous rampage of the suburbia in the Willamette Valley all threaten to mock Oregon's status as the environmental model of the nation. We are in dire need of a state land use policy, new subdivision laws, and new standards for planning and zoning by cities and counties. The interests of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from the grasping wastrels, I guess, of the land. We must respect another truism that unlimited and unregulated growth leads inexorably to a lower quality of life. And those are some strong words, and I'm not saying we all have to agree every single sentence and so forth.
But there was true leadership there.
He was.
And he was inspirational to our agency, our work.
Right. He was right with us.
And so many people in the state. That kind of leadership and also the leadership of others was just instrumental
it really was.
And so
in the work we did.
We'll have that today. Right now, it's Governor Brown's, I think, it looks like. Yeah. Maybe she will lose, maybe she'll win. I hope she'll win, but that's my personal view.
Well, we will.
Where are we going
wrap
to go?
this.
That's the question,
Well,
that's the hard question.
Because, again, I think the challenges we face ahead are every bit as challenging as the one we faced when these plans were put together. I don't think that we've settled everything. It's, and it really scares me when I've traveled out of state to see what has happened across the country.
Or not
that don't-
happened, yeah.
Or not happened, that don't have what Oregon has. I mean, we can complain and say our program is not as good as it should be, but boy, thank goodness we've got it.
Well, I think we'll end on a happy note because we're light years ahead of other states around the country. So we've got a good
foundation.
foundation, that's the word for
Well,
it.
40 years now have
Yeah.
passed.
Yeah.
Now, turn the page, so to speak. Where are we going?
We can't rest on our laurels.
But who's in charge of our laurels? You know, we have our legislature, we have our appointed and elected officials, local governments,
Yeah.
and all the challenges that they are facing at the
Yeah.
local level, let alone
We've
our.
got to educate the folks moving into the state,
How do we do that?
young people.
Well, there was a conversation when the goals were just a
Right.
pipe dream.
Right,
I mean,
right.
there were meeting after meeting. I wasn't here, but they're legendary.
Yes.
This is where input around the state was gathered, and
We had some consensus, didn't we?
Well, it seemed
Or
like
not. I mean, I guess it's maybe arguable.
But there
You could
had to
say-
be, otherwise the goals would have never come about.
Yeah,
So,
and they had the force of law.
yeah, yeah.
I think as opposed to earlier stuff back in what, Senate Bill 10
Right.
days,
Mhm,
it wasn't didn't have the kind of bite
Right.
that the goals that we have
Right.
today brought.
Right.
Now, where are we going from here? Are we satisfied? And I'm just talking rhetorically here, but what's ahead?
I think we need a broad scale.
And that's what I'd
Public
love to get out of
education campaign.
these interviews. You hear two people, experts, you know, and we're battering back and forth, and not batting, but
Yeah.
we're talking about it, and we've had so many other interviews. And where do we go from
Have
here?
you heard great ideas from a bunch of other people on those questions? Anything that,
Not so much. I think it's more looking back
yeah.
and sort of judging how we've done, but what lies ahead, that's the hard part.
You know, I think there does need to be a conversation, but there's always a risk in having big public dialogue because that could unravel things as well. You know, I know within the natural resource community, there's some talk, I don't know, I just caught a bit of this about a year ago, but some people are thinking we need a public dialogue about fish and wildlife resources and recreation resources and stuff like that. I have no idea if that's going to come about or not, but
And how do we bring those of us who have these shared concerns and worries, frankly, together? I'm not saying that it's out there to be had, but it needs to be approached,
yeah,
I think.
yeah.
Well, there are some efforts some small efforts that are going on. You know, Nellie McAdams has put together this Working Lands Collaborative, a group of mostly retired land use folks to talk about current issues to do with the land use planning program that we felt aren't being adequately addressed, and one of them is public education. And I'm working on a curriculum for the outdoor school that would involve a hands-on land use activity with a raised relief map for 5th and 6th graders, for example. So I don't know, maybe other people are doing other things, but it's certainly a multi-pronged approach I think needs to happen, and being complacent is not going to, and being reactive and is not going to do it. But DLCD lost its public outreach person years ago because of funding cuts, and they just don't, it doesn't have enough funding to have a person in that, in a position like that. And also, I don't think the legislature wants them to take an active role.
The legislature also, from time to time, has said that they want an east side, west side, or set of goals. That's probably not quite accurate.
I think we have some of that, say, in our EFU zoning.
You get bills every
You get
legislative
bills
session.
that the acceptable minimum lot size for one part of Oregon, the west side is different than the east side. And is that square with the program? I think it does, but,
Recognizing different conditions.
and the same thing is true for managing other resources, you know, water, land use,
Yeah. Yeah.
game, and
Yeah.
so forth. Gosh, and we just had a big scare here in Salem with the water,
Yeah.
you know,
yeah.
and that caught us all by, I'm not going to say surprise, but there was some real threats to
Yeah.
certain limited communities of people and animals and so forth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
are we on guard to sort of respond to this in a collective way?
Well-
These are easy questions, so to speak, to ask, but how do you get
Well,
answers?
and the whole housing, and I didn't work on the housing goal or issues
Sure.
at all, but that's a big one.
Well, the whole homeless thing is just
Yeah.
terrible.
So I'm gonna wrap this up today for purposes of filming. And thank you, Claire, on behalf
You're
of
welcome.
PSU and the Oral History Project. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Thanks for
So
sharing and having a great conversation, going back into the depths of history.